Welcome to my cherry guide for UFO 50's Avianos. The cherry requirement is to beat all 8 scenarios. The first 3 all have the same rules and the only difficulty increase is in the enemy AI. The last 5 scenarios, or trials, will add bonus rules that you'll have to play around, often to the opponent's benefit. The aim of the game is to control 4 castles. If you or your opponent holds 4 of these castles for 2 turns, the game will end. Each scenario you'll be met with a similar board. Most of these spaces are very similar, however there are mountain spaces that are far harder to traverse. You will need upgraded movement or a certain miracle to pass over or through mountains. The other unique spaces are the castles you'll need to control to win. Unsurprisingly, these castles offer an advantage in defending since they'll funnel the enemies into you. Most actions in this game can only be used once. For example, a movement action can only be used on a group of units on a single space. Bear that in mind as grouping units can take a while, so usually you'll want to build up your forces before moving in the first place. Actions that involve recruiting units or building structures on certain spaces are not limited to one space a turn though. Simply press X to select another valid space and you can do more there. One of my biggest gripes with this game is the inability to undo or go backwards on turns. You press Z to do everything. Pick spaces, pick options on the actions, and to continue the actions. This is all fine. The issue comes when there is only one option. For example, if there's only one space you can use an action on, the game will be helpful and automatically select it for you. If you don't realise it's already selected and attempt to press Z to select the space, you will instead continue with the next part of the turn, whether that be building a structure or recruiting a unit you may not have necessarily wanted to. You cannot go back in your turn, so anything you purchase is locked in. It took me a while to get used to this, but try not to spam Z too much in order to not make the same mistake as I often did. Each time you play, the map is randomised, so feel free to reset and go into it again if you get a terrible map layout. You will have to replay that scenario, but all previously completed scenarios will remain completed. When moving units, you can only move units from one space at a time. You can move as many units from that space as you'd like though. You can alter the number of units you would like to move once you select the space. Often you'll want to move all of them, but there are benefits to leaving some units behind, whether it be to leave units defending a space or to leave a unit to eventually capture out of the way spaces. If a space is already occupied by an enemy, you enter combat with them. When you move onto an empty space, you'll get some of the resource shown on that space, for example seeds. Harder to reach mountain spaces often have more resources. Owning more spaces is nice since you can build structures that can give resources on turns you use specific ancestors. Sometimes these structures provide other things as well, dependent on the action, which we'll go over more later. If you ever try to contest a space that's owned by your opponent, you will enter a combat phase, where you compete for the space. This also happens if they move onto one of your spaces. Any enemy units on that space will try to defend. There are 4 options for combat: attack, hold, raise, and flee. Often when you're attacking, you'll want to leave your units on attack. Hold is nice for defense, particularly on castle levels where your archers can take out many enemies on approach before the rest get involved. Raise can be selected to get your units to focus the structures on that space. This will remove the structures from the space, meaning that the opposing team doesn't get to take the structures for free. Flee makes your units start to run away towards your edge of the screen. If they make it to the edge, they will escape and live to fight another day. If they successfully flee, they will move to a nearby space. This is definitely a good option if you're heavily outnumbered. Only a certain number of units can be on screen at any given time, and any extra will reinforce and appear from the side of the screen when a different unit dies. You can see the number of reinforcing units at the top of the screen. If you're heavily outnumbered, consider fleeing. Fleeing, however, does often mean that you'll lose a vast number of your forces, particularly if you have a lot of reinforcements. This is because once a unit flees, the reinforcing unit will appear briefly before fleeing themselves. In this small duration, they're vulnerable to getting killed immediately. This does work both ways, so a fleeing enemy with many reinforcements will typically lose many additional units as they reinforce. Obviously, fleeing may still be the best option, as it's better to lose half your units instead of all of them. Just bear in mind it's not an ideal scenario to be in. Generally for combat, as long as you outnumber the opponent, you're fine, although that isn't necessarily the case for castles. For castles, since archers are so good for defense, you should always bring some bombers and knights to combat this. I'll go over the different units in more detail later when going over the actions. Also, sometimes units can get stuck on one another, which can cause a pile up where lots of your units aren't doing anything, particularly if they're stuck behind a slow moving priest. There isn't much you can do about this since you can't give certain units particular commands and have to command your units as a whole. Defending castles is much easier than normal spaces since the attacking units will typically have to breach the castle. Archers are incredible for defense on castle sections, so always stack a bunch of archers on castle spaces if you can. Each turn you'll get to select an Ancestor which will provide you with 3 actions. These always happen in a certain order and have different effects. We'll go over the effects of each action shortly. There are 5 Ancestors total, and each turn you can choose between 3 of them. This is not random, you will always have a choice between the 3 Ancestors that weren't most recently selected. Basically, whichever Ancestor you and your opponent last used is not available, all the others are available to choose from. You can use this to deny your opponent a certain Ancestor on their next turn as well. Every time you select an Ancestor you will gain favour with that Ancestor, and every 2 times you gain favour you'll get a blessing. This allows you to choose an action to upgrade for all future uses. Each action can be upgraded twice, and you can max out the Ancestor after selecting it 12 times. You can see how blessed an action is by the stars that appear next to the title. These blessings are incredibly useful and can make units, buildings and miracles cheaper, as well as grant bonuses to movement. I'll go over each type of action. After that I'll go over the Ancestors themselves and explain their particular actions and how they synergize together. To start with, we have the Produce action. This grants you a number of resources depending on the Ancestor using it, and also how many of a certain structure you have. Look out for the symbol on the right to see which structures grant which resource. There is no limit to this. For example, with Trilock, you produce 2 bones for each house of worship you have, not just the first. There are 3 types of currency: seeds, bones and workers. Typically the seeds are used to get units, the bones are used for miracles, which we'll go over shortly, and the workers are used to build structures, although there are cases where a resource is used for something else. You can only have a maximum of 99 seeds, 9 bones and 9 workers at a time. Blessing a produce action often grants more resources and occasionally an additional resource entirely. I would always bless this action early to increase my income. The recruit action allows you to spend resources on units, typically spending seeds. You can recruit units to any castles you control, but can also recruit at any yellow military nests you have control of. For this reason, consider building military nests on spaces you want to easily reinforce. There's no limit to an amount of units you can have on a space, although to be fair I haven't tested this thoroughly and haven't passed 200 of any unit type. Blessing this action makes recruiting these units cheaper and often adds more recruitable units as well. Arguably I'd prioritise blessing this over other actions. There are 5 different unit types you can get via recruiting or other methods. Dodo soldiers are your standard melee units. They're the cheapest to recruit and still very effective to have, even if they're just there to eat fire until your other units can close the gap. Duck archers are incredible units, particularly for defense. On castle spaces they'll spawn on elevation and will have increased range, so can rain fire onto enemies while they approach. They're countered by the next unit we'll go over, but I always loved stacking as many archers as possible. Just bear in mind you'll want other units to shore up the archer's weakness. And that brings us to the Hawk Knights. These units wield a shield that block all ranged fire. They attack incredibly slowly while their shield remains unbroken, but you aren't getting these units for their offensive capability. You'll definitely want to bring some knights when attacking a space, particularly when going for castles. Owl priests deal high damage but are shorter range than your standard archers. They also move incredibly slowly, so will often be desynced to other attacking units. Their attacks can often one-shot units when they do get in range though. Since they move so slowly, when in small corridors they can cause pile-ups of your units, which can be a real detriment. Fortunately though, these situations are rare. Overall I didn't find these units to be the best, but it's always nice to have a mixture of units. Despite being all avian units, humming bombers are the only flying units you can get. Since they fly, they can avoid hits from soldiers and knights completely. They also ignore elevation, significant on castle battles since they can immediately rush to the archers posted up on the walls. The major weakness to these units is that they can be shot by archers and priests, but if they do get on top of enemies they'll drop high damage bombs that one-shot units and also deal area of effect damage as well. These units are also the fastest units in the game, both a benefit and a flaw since by rushing forward so fast they make themselves vulnerable to be hit immediately. Ideally you'll want to have some bombers in your attacking parties. The build action gives you the ability to build structures on any owned space, including castles. These structures often provide benefits, so it's useful to build these early to help get more resources as the game progresses. There are 4 structures total you could build, and they often provide exactly what you would expect. Mostly they are used to provide bonus resources for Ancestors when they use the produce action, but can have other benefits as well. Consider building structures that will provide resources that help the Ancestors you aim to primarily use. Remember, there is a limit to how many resources you can have at one time, which is 99 seeds, 9 bones, and 9 workers. There is also a limit of 3 structures per space. You can have 3 of the same structure though if you would like. First, the green seed factories often provide bonus seeds on ancestors that have the produce action. The purple houses of worship provide bones for ancestors that produce from them. These bones are the currency to use miracles, which I'll go over shortly. The blue worker baths often provide additional workers. Primarily the workers are used for building, so getting some of these early can be helpful, not so much later on. The yellow military nests have no application when it comes to production, but do allow you to recruit on spaces that have them. Blessing a build action makes each structure cheaper to build, so it can be nice to bless early but pretty useless later on. Also, often ancestors with build actions will have no other actions that are more worth blessing. A miracle action allows you to spend bones on special abilities. You can use the same miracle multiple times in the same turn if you can afford to. Only 2 ancestors have the ability to perform miracles, and they each have different ones. Blessing this action makes each miracle cheaper, sometimes meaning you can use certain more expensive miracles multiple times in the same turn. I'll go over the 2 ancestors and their miracles after this section. Muster gives you units on any space you own with the desired structure. Only Quetzal has a muster action. Since it provides units on any space with these structures, you can spawn in many units across all of them. The main issue with this is that since it spawns units on different spaces, you cannot move them together without using lots of turns to group them up. Also, realistically, you can only get between 3 and 6 units per space, which really isn't much. I'd much rather pray to a different ancestor that can produce resources, which I can spend on units that I want, and can also group together at castles or military nests. I would actually consider not blessing this action, since while it gives stronger units, it actually ends up giving fewer units when upgraded. Overall though, I found this action to be a bait and wouldn't suggest ever praying to Quetzal really. The trade action is one of the weaker ones in my opinion, and can only be found on Quetzal. It allows you to trade bones for seeds and seeds for workers. This can be a useful way to get workers if you aren't interested in building worker baths, but I still find other ancestors give far more resources as long as you give it a bit of effort. That said, if you do choose Quetzal enough to bless this action, it can be great value per resource, effectively turning a bone into 4 workers for example. Finally, most ancestors have the movement action with the exception of Trilock and Brontor, although Trilock does have the magic flight miracle that allows you to teleport. These movement actions allow you to move one space with any number of units. You can only move once though, so bear that in mind. When moving, you get a choice on how many units to move from that space, so you can leave some units behind to defend the previous space. Often I didn't find much value in this except for castle spaces, or if you wanted to leave a unit to capture out of the way spaces. From blessings you can gain the ability to move through mountains, move diagonally, or do a surprise attack. The first 2 are pretty self-explanatory and can be nice to navigate awkward terrain, but the surprise attack is arguably the most powerful, particularly when attacking a castle. On surprise attacks, all enemy units are unable to do anything until one has been hit by one of the attacking units. This gives far less time to raise any structures or gun down the incoming units, plus usually you kill a few units before they even start hitting back. The surprise attack gives a huge benefit to the attacker in these scenarios. If you yourself get surprise attacked, be ready to select an action for your units as soon as you're able to. Now let's go over the ancestors themselves. To start with Quetzal, the weakest ancestor in my opinion. They have a muster, move and trade action. I went over muster before when going over the actions. This allows you to spawn units on any spaces with certain structures, but overall I found it much more effective to pick other ancestors that allow you to produce your resources and spend them yourself. For example, if you build tons of seed factories instead of these other structures, you can max out on seeds from Rexadon's produce action. To start with, you can muster 2 soldiers per military nest. Then, with a blessing, this changes to where you can get 1 knight per military nest and 1 priest per house of worship. Finally, with the second blessing, it will also grant 1 bomber at any worker baths, in addition to the priest and the knight. Consider not blessing this action, since while it will grant stronger units, you can get more from leaving it unupgraded and simply mustering on spaces with 3 military nests. Although as I mentioned I didn't find much value in this action at all. After mustering, Quetzal will grant you a movement. When blessed, this will first give you the ability to pass through mountains, and on second blessing will also allow you to move diagonally. Nice to navigate awkward terrain, but I would consider other ancestors' movement to be better, since they often get the surprise attack upgrade. Finally, the trade action. This has some uses in that it is a way to reliably get workers, but it will require you to have seeds or bones to trade for them. By default you can trade 1 bone for 4 seeds and 4 seeds for 1 worker, or effectively 1 bone for 1 worker. When blessed once, it lets you trade 1 bone for 6 seeds and 3 seeds for 1 worker, and on second blessing you can trade 1 bone for 9 seeds and 2 seeds for 1 worker. You get far more value per resource when it's blessed to this stage, getting 4 workers per bone. For this reason, if you do want to use Quetzal to get cheap workers, I would consider blessing this action first. If you do decide to use Quetzal, you want to use it with Stegnar or Brontor, since they can build the structures you'll need to muster units. It also synergizes decently, since Quetzal can also provide the workers needed to build said structures. If you aren't interested in building worker baths, you can use Trilock, since they can produce bones, which you can trade with Quetzal to get workers that way. You will still have to use one of the Ancestors with build to build the structures you'll need to muster units onto. Stegnar has the move, build and recruit actions. Stegnar can be great, but will need to be used after an Ancestor that produces resources, since it does not produce anything itself. It's also interesting in that you move first before any other action. The move action when blessed first gains surprise attack, and on second blessing also gains through mountain. Honestly, the ability to get surprise attack so early is definitely a benefit to using Stegnar, although I often play Stir, so I don't mind getting the move upgrades later on. That said, if you want a fast paced match, using surprise attacks is definitely a way to go about it. The fact that when blessed again this allows you to pass through mountains makes it the only movement action that allows you to surprise attack mountain spaces. Next you'll have the option to build structures. By default you can build a seed factory for 2 workers, a military nest for 3 workers, and a house of worship for 3 workers. When blessed once, this is reduced to 1 worker for a seed factory, 2 workers for a military nest, and 2 workers for a house of worship. Consider blessing this early to get cheap seed factories, since they can be great to stack in combination with other Ancestors. When blessed twice, this is further reduced to 1 worker for a seed factory, 1 worker for a military nest, and 1 worker for a house of worship. As I mentioned, Stegnar doesn't produce any resources itself, but these cheap structures are a good incentive to use Stegnar early, as long as you bless the build action to start with. A benefit of using Stegnar to build is that you can bless the build action first without worrying about missing out on blessing a different action, for example produce. Finally, Stegnar can recruit. It's odd to be able to recruit after moving, but that is the case with Stegnar. By default, Stegnar can recruit knights for 8 seeds each and bombers for 10 seeds each. When blessed once, it can recruit knights for 5 seeds, bombers for 7 seeds, and priests for 2 bones. While expensive, these are the only units you can recruit using bones, so if you're not interested in using your bones on miracles, you can use them here. Where miracles provide a temporary reward in most cases, by using the bones on units you get something a bit more permanent, although obviously the units can still die. When blessed twice you can get knights for 4 seeds, bombers for 5 seeds, and priests for 1 bone. I often found Stegnar was my "there's really not anything else useful to me" option. The movement when upgraded is nice for the surprise attack, and the units it can recruit are somewhat unique, but other Ancestors can recruit and build more easily. You'll want to wait to choose Stegnar until you've gained resources from other Ancestors, namely Rexadon and Brontor. Typically when using Stegnar I would bless their movement first, and they'd be the Ancestor I choose if I want to use an upgraded movement early into the game. That said, build or recruit are good options to bless in certain cases, but go more dependent on which other Ancestors you're using. Next we have Brontor, a great Ancestor to help build up your structures and also provides some utility in miracles. Interestingly, Brontor is the only Ancestor that provides 0 ability to move units when selected. Brontor has the produce, build and miracle actions. The great thing about Brontor compared to Stegnar is that Brontor can produce its own resources to build with. Brontor will always start by producing. By default they will produce 4 seeds per seed factory, 1 bone per house of worship, and 1 worker per worker bath. When blessed once, they produce 5 seeds per seed factory, 1 bone per house of worship, and 2 workers per worker bath. And when blessed again, they'll produce 6 seeds per seed factory, 2 bones per house of worship, and 2 workers per worker bath. Brontor is unique in that it can produce all 3 resource types at once. Next, you have the option to build structures. By default, you can build a worker bath for 4 seeds, a seed factory with 2 workers, or a house of worship for 3 workers. Being able to build structures using seeds is a major benefit to Brontor. When blessed once, this reduces the cost to 3 seeds for a worker bath, 1 worker for a seed factory, and 2 workers for a house of worship. Bless this early so that you can build seed factories for cheap to combo with Rexadon, who we'll go over later on. When blessed twice, you can build worker baths for just 2 seeds, seed factories for 1 worker, and a house of worship for 1 worker. Being able to build worker baths using seeds is a great way to help gain more workers, although you'll have to wait a minimum of 2 turns before you can select Brontor again to get those workers. Finally, we have Brontor's Miracles. Brontor has the Sacred Offering, Earth Move, and Snowstorm Miracles. The Sacred Offering miracle costs 3 bones by default and allows you to gain 1 favour with any chosen Ancestor. This is effectively what happens when you pick an Ancestor and get closer to the blessing. You can use this on Brontor himself and bless this action in order to more easily afford further Sacred Offerings at a cheaper rate. When blessed once, this miracle costs 2 bones and twice only 1 bone. Earth Move allows you to move a mountain to another location. It costs 3 bones to start with. This can be useful to stop advancing enemy units or to move a mountain out of your way. There are ways to pass mountains, but generally it can be nice to stall your opponent or just place it in a way that will defend a castle. You can move a mountain onto a castle spot, which is incredible for defense. When blessed once, this miracle costs 2 bones and twice 1 bone. The Snowstorm miracle costs 6 bones by default. This freezes a space on the map, making it so that no enemy units can move for 2 turns. This can have its uses, but generally since you don't know where the enemy units are, it can be a pain to use effectively. That said, it can be nice to confirm a victory in the end if you use it on forces about to invade your 4th castle on the final turn. The enemies always know where your units are when they use this miracle, so they can be a real menace. However, it rarely is more than an annoyance. When blessed once, this miracle costs 3 bones and twice 2 bones. I often consider miracles late game options, so usually bless this action last. However, feel free to bless it sooner if you can think of a good application for it, for example if you need to snowstorm 2 different tiles in the same turn. Brontor is a great supportive Ancestor to use in combination with many other Ancestors. Trilock is the other Ancestor that doesn't come with a movement action. It's also the only other Ancestor to have miracles. Trilock has the Produce, Recruit and Miracle actions. Trilock's Produce action is different to the others, as by default it doesn't produce any seeds. By default you get 3 bones plus an additional 2 bones per house of worship. When blessed once, you get bones at the same rate as before, but you'll also get 8 seeds. When blessed a second time, you get another 8 seeds, making the total 16 seeds, 3 bones, plus 2 bones per house of worship. The extra seeds can be nice to recruit with, but since blessing doesn't provide any additional bones, consider blessing this action later into the game. Next, you will have the option to recruit. By default, you can recruit priests for 8 seeds. When blessed once, you can recruit priests for 5 seeds, bombers for 8 seeds, and archers for 1 worker. While I usually don't like purchasing units with workers, I think archers are very powerful units, so are worth the investment if you don't need the workers for other things. When blessed again, this worker trade is changed to priests, which while being more expensive units, I do actually prefer getting archers instead, so consider not blessing this action a second time immediately. When blessed again, you can recruit priests for 4 seeds, bombers for 6 seeds, and priests for 1 worker. I'm not a big fan of the worker trades, but if you're done with building and don't have much use for your workers, consider using them to recruit here. Finally, we have Trilock's Miracles. The first miracle is Holy Vision. It costs 3 bones by default. This reveals an enemy location for 4 turns. This shows you any structures on that space as well as any enemy units. This can be useful when used before using Brontor's miracles, since their miracles often require knowledge on the enemy's location. That said, I really didn't find using this miracle very helpful, and often would save my bones for other miracles. When blessed once, this miracle costs 2 bones and twice 1 bone. The second miracle is Magic Flight. In my opinion, this is the best miracle in the game. While Trilock doesn't have a movement action, this effectively replaces that, and allows you to move multiple times in the same turn if used multiple times. Not to mention it also has double the usual movement range, and is able to ignore mountains. It costs 6 bones by default, but by blessing the miracle, you can get it down to 4 bones after 1 blessing and 3 bones after the second blessing. This means that you can move units practically anywhere on the board in a single turn when this action is at 2 blessings. For this miracle alone, Trilock is an excellent Ancestor to pray to. Consider using this miracle from Trilock on the final turn of a match to attack multiple castles at once and confirm your victory. The third miracle is Lightning Strike. It costs 9 bones by default but can be reduced in cost by blessing the action. When blessed once, this miracle costs 7 bones and twice 4 bones. This miracle kills 2 units of each type on a chosen tile. It can be useful on spaces with many different types of units, but often there'll be many more enemies stacked on a space, making it actually not very impactful later into the game. Also, since you don't know the location of the enemies, it can be awkward, although you can use the Holy Vision miracle beforehand to know when it's optimal to use Lightning Strike. When the enemy uses this, it can be annoying since they'll always know the location of your units. You can try to counteract the enemy using this by stacking many of the same units rather than getting some of each, however I often didn't really overthink this. Later in the match, 2 of each unit really isn't much of a dent. Since Trilock can produce bones at a high rate, it can be great in combination with Brontor if you want to use some of their miracles instead. That said, I do find Trilock's miracles far more powerful. Rexadon is in my opinion a must-have for any mission. They have the best produce action in the game and can also recruit archers, which are incredibly useful. Rexadon has the produce, recruit and move actions. First, Rexadon produces a ton of seeds. By default you get 10 seeds plus an additional 3 seeds per seed factory in your control. When blessed once you gain the same seeds as before, 10 seeds plus an additional 3 per seed factory, although you do also get a worker for each worker buff you have. This changes when blessed a second time, as you'll gain 18 seeds automatically, with an additional 3 for every factory. You also still get a worker for each worker buff you have. You can get to an absurd amount of seeds with this, allowing you to recruit massively. This is the main reason Rexadon should be a staple of any mission. Next, Rexadon allows you to recruit soldiers and archers. By default, soldiers cost 4 seeds and archers cost 6 seeds. When blessed once, this reduces the cost of soldiers to 3 seeds each and archers to 4. You also gain the option to use workers to recruit soldiers as well, with 1 soldier costing 1 worker, although I didn't find this option particularly appealing. There are often better uses for your workers. When blessed a second time, the seed costs for soldiers and archers are reduced even further, only costing 2 seeds per soldier and 3 per archer. Also, instead of using a worker to recruit a soldier, they will now recruit knights instead, at the same cost, 1 worker for 1 knight. This trade I found a lot more appealing than the soldier one, since knights are harder to come by. Being able to recruit archers is excellent as they're one of the best units to recruit, particularly for defending castle spaces. That said, do consider saving some seeds for other ancestors that can use them to recruit different unit types. Finally, Rexadon finishes by moving. When blessed once, you gain the ability to move diagonally, and when blessed again, the movement will gain a surprise attack trait, which is extremely powerful. You'll want to bless the produce and recruit actions first in order to build up your army quickly. Typically I prioritise blessing recruit over produce, since blessing produce doesn't actually provide more seeds immediately. If you use Rexadon with Brontor, you can have Brontor making tons of seed factories, which will allow you to recruit at crazy levels. On the final 2 trials, the actions will be randomised, so you'll want to look out for certain actions rather than the Ancestor itself. I like to look out for the produce action usually found on Rexadon as your primary way of getting resources. Also look out for the produce action that gives bones that is usually found on Trilock. I also keep a lookout for the miracle action with magic flight, since this ability can be very powerful. The other miracle action has obscure uses with snowstorm, but generally isn't too required. You also want to look out for good recruit actions, ideally the one with the archers. You're hoping that certain ancestors will have multiple of these actions so that you only need to focus on a few of them. Sometimes the order of these actions don't work as well as normal, for example having a produce action after a recruit action, but at the very least your opponent has to deal with the same problem. Also feel free to restart the map if you're not happy with them. Any movement options will show their blessing in purple text. This is not immediate and will need to be blessed before gaining those effects. The purple text is simply to show you beforehand what the movement will upgrade to when it is blessed. Now to go over the trials themselves. As I mentioned before, the first 3 scenarios just introduce you to the game, where the 5 trials will add additional rules. To start with Trial 1. On Trial 1 the enemy simply starts with some extra seeds. This means that they can reinforce slightly more, but generally this is a very simple trial to beat. Trial 2, things start to get more interesting. The enemy would already control 2 castles on mission start. From this point onwards I would seriously consider resetting if you get a bad board. For example, if the enemy controls 2 castles central and can easily expand into 2 more. Otherwise though, this trial isn't too tough, just make sure to contest at minimum 3 castles while you bolster your forces and then go in to take control when you can. Trial 3, the enemy has the blessing of Trilock. This means that they start with 2 favour on Trilock, unlocking a blessing immediately. Simply play your game and Trial 3 shouldn't be too bad. Again, only a slight change. Enjoy this one before Trial 4 comes and the world gets flipped upside down. Trial 4 is where things get truly interesting. In terms of difficulty, the jump to Trial 4 is much larger than any other we've had in my opinion. It randomises every action between the ancestors. All that time you spent learning the ancestors is now thrown away and you'll have to look more at the actions themselves and choosing according to that. I mentioned earlier the main actions I like to focus on, which are the produce and recruit actions, as well as the miracle action with magic flight. Now for Trial 5, the final challenge. Here instead of castles there are simply flag spaces to capture. The flag spaces are much harder to defend than normal castles, although massing archers is still a viable defense strategy. Thankfully the flag spaces do still allow you to reinforce as if they are a castle. Another aspect that makes Trial 5 so difficult is that it includes all the previous Trials rule additions, including the randomized actions. From Trial 2, the enemy will start with 2 flags controlled, and they will remain castles, which makes them harder to attack. Since the flags the enemy start with remain castles, it's likely you'll want to control all the other flags as they'll be easier to attack. That said, it is still possible to take the castles. I just personally found it really worth the hassle, since typically they are so engrossed in enemy territory. Trial 5 is definitely a challenge. Remember, you can restart if the board is not favourable, and try to use all the tools at your disposal. In particular, remember to use miracles like Earth Move and Magic Flight. Remember also, by selecting an Ancestor you deny it from your opponent, so if they're getting annoying with certain actions you can take them away, for example with Snowstorm. Hopefully you found this guide helpful, and best of luck on your attempts. If you have any additional tips, please leave a comment. Thanks for watching.